Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just having a computer reboot right now, so we'll start, and I'll look for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. I have one. It's on a confidential C4. I'm an executive director with a social service agency that has contracts with the municipality dealing with Ontario Works, which are QP 101 employees. So, seeing no other disclosures, we have consent items 2 through 10. And number 10, we're going to pull, and we're going to deal with number 10 after we deal with the confidential item that pertains to that matter. So from 2 to 9, anyone want to pull any of those items? Councillor Usher. And good afternoon, Councillor.
Good afternoon, sir. Nice to have you here. I have a statement I'd like to make about 2, but I'd like to pull 4, 5, 6, and 7.
Okay. Councillor Howard.
I'd like to pull 9.
You want to pull 9? And I think out of respect for Councillor Van Holst, he'd like us to talk about 2, which is the billboard. Or sorry, it's item number 3. So given that, we're just going to march through them one by one, I guess. So let's start with item number 2. We're just going to march through them all one by one since we're almost pulling all of them. Okay, item number 2, Councillor Usher.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to do a little praise for the report here because I think that this is a very, very important report, and it's it puts a lot of things into perspective for me, and I'm accustomed to most of this stuff. So if it does that for me, then I'm sure that it does for others. Sorry. I think that when it comes to the budget for provincial and federal government, and our own budget for that matter, it is always very helpful to have a report of this nature. Well, one of the things that I'd like to, and I don't want to downplay the author of this report in any way, I just think that from my perspective, being a board member of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, I think that I'd like to see a little bit more things addressing the, thank you very much, addressing the part that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities play in this. And I keep saying this, and I say it for a specific reason, because I know that we spend a lot of time advocating with the MPs and as far as the leaders of the staff of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities play, they also play a major role when we are not present with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance and Minister of Infrastructure and many of the others. And that's how, to a very large extent, from my perspective, that we get so much into the budget. And a lot of the money, the billions of dollars that we hear about over the next 10 years, I think that a lot of it is through discussion, and I'm not saying it's the only discussion, but I'm saying that a lot of it is through the discussion that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities have with the federal government. And I bring that out because I know that we do that in the background, but I think it's important that we as a council recognize that, because there are other people out there who try to take the credit for this. And I'm not knocking those people. They do play a part in it, but a large part of it is because the federal government listens to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, who speaks on behalf of all the municipalities across Canada before the budget, in time for the budget, so that we could get the money for the budget put in place. So I wanted to bring that up, and I still want to thank the author for the presentation. They may have something I want to say about it, because I'm not trying to criticize in any way. I'm trying to build on what they have to say. Thank you.
That item's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? I'll call the question. Clerk says that the motion carried 4-0. Let's move to item number 3, billboard advertising tender. I'm going to put that out there. I'm going to turn Councillor Van Holst. This is in response to a request that you, I think, had brought forward, an issue that you had advocated on. So I'm going to turn to you. I know you've got a couple comments. If you could highlight them, and perhaps just before you do that, can we get sort of a 30-second summary of where we ended up on this issue from a staff perspective before I go to the councillor? Mr. Yeoman, are you carrying the football on this one?
Through the chair, yes, I am. I greatly appreciate it.
I just hope you don't get sacked in the backfield. So.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being before you today. So this is just a follow-up report from Council's direction in December to look at opportunities for billboard advertising, looking at our existing sites and opportunities for community community advertising and city advertising as well. This has been contingent on the approval of the sign bylaw, the new sign bylaw that's been put in place, which Council approved last month. Staff undertook an extensive analysis looking at other opportunities in city-owned lands for billboards purposes. You can see some of the analysis that we've summarized the analysis in the report. Looking originally at 158 sites, which we then scoped down based on certain exclusions in the sign bylaw, also excluding our industrial lands properties, so we weren't in conflict with our industrial land development strategy, and a number of other exclusions as well. From there, we had 19 sites that we circulated. The comments that we received back identified concerns with all 19 sites, and many sites, actually most sites, had multiple concerns that were identified as well. So as a result, staff do not believe that there are other opportunities to come forward with for billboards advertising locations on city-owned lands. At this point, then, our intent is to proceed with a tender for the existing 8 sites. You'll recall that the current lease expires in October of this year. That tender, we're going to seek opportunities for city advertising and community group advertising as well with it. So I think that's sort of the 30 seconds, Mr. Chair, and happy to take any questions.
Okay. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'll say that, of course, you know well that it's the role of the governing body to challenge the assumptions of management, and so I'm going to do that a little bit today. You recall 2.5 years ago that I put forward an idea, and it was unanimously endorsed by council. It's for a powerful communication tool that could also generate enough revenue to pay for itself. And just putting that in context, a communication tool. Recently with the BRT, we've discovered that the thing our corporation probably does worst is communication. We were kind of, taken to school by the downshift group, and we didn't have a way to rapidly send a message, which something like this could have done. So the first thing that surprised me was that staff would have looked at 153 sites and couldn't have found one that was appropriate. And so I did a little digging and said, well, how was that? What were the sites? And I got a map of the sites, and I visited them yesterday. I also asked for the list of comments that went out to staff. And I guess I was a bit disappointed because in some ways they weren't really looking for opportunities as we had directed them, but essentially denying opportunities. Some were kind of surprising. There were comments, for instance, this might be a good place to plant trees in the future. So now we've got conflicting priorities, which it's council that has to decide on those. But the most surprising was from the the long range, from the planning department, that said that a number of the sites were on major arterial roads at gateways to the city. And of course, this is the perfect place for a billboard. It's if anyone was trying to find one, if we were gonna lease a space to anybody or construct one ourselves, that's exactly where you would put them. As a matter of fact, a couple of them have a nice kilometer viewing, so it's absolutely ideal. And when I looked at the actual comments, it said that, well, these would be visual clutter. And that's why they were denied. Well, here, I think this may be a case of the tail wagging the dog. I think it was council's direction to look for opportunities here. Certainly this idea wasn't designed for clutter. And I simply categorically reject those claims and say that we actually have some fantastic opportunities there. These we might look at in the future. The other was the idea of, should we use these ourselves? Be in the business, is there a business case for having a billboard that sells some advertising and also has some community messaging? And it was said in the report, which was very, very short on facts. Really, it's very difficult to deal with the report when there's nothing to challenge. All the committee really can do is say, well, staff made a recommendation, we might have to take it. But again, I went and did a little digging and said, well, where were your numbers for this? And I have them here, and they presented sort of two scenarios, the low and the high scenario, in terms of the cost it would for the leases. And in one situation, we'd make $184,000. In the other situation, there was a loss of $96,000, and that was the risk that was described in the report, or was referred to. And then I asked, where did you get these numbers? And they said, well, those are your numbers. And these are the ones that I had supplied originally, and I'm a little disappointed because I expected that some more homework would have been done to look into this. But also, I'm afraid this was, the risk analysis was a little bit bungled, because in the numbers I provided with these lease figures, after a few years, we just pay $1 and then own the assets. And so after year 4, none of these lease expenses exist, and it's sheer profit from this. So I think there's still a wonderful business case, both for expanding to other sites in the city, which we have a number that are ideal. And of course, the committee doesn't need to have to deal with that. We can deal with that in a future, at a future time. However, looking at the idea of, are we going to use this for community messaging, which I still believe is extremely important if we're going to be able to change the way we think. In any ways, we're going to have to be able to communicate with ourselves. We're constantly getting bombarded by messaging from corporations, but if we want to do the simplest things like change the way people drive, this is going to be valuable to us. As I said before, we're going to be able to repatriate some of the funds. We have groups that we pay, the health unit,
Councillor,
the fire department.
Can you focus on what you'd like this committee to do?
Okay, thank you very much. So what I'm going to request the committee is that you simply forward this to council. So, I've had to do quite a bit of work just in the very last few days and even last night to find out where we're at. And what I'd like to do is come up with just another recommendation there. It'll be slightly different, provide just a little bit of direction that I think council will be fine with. But what that will save is having to defeat a motion at council, which unfortunately, if we follow the direction that's here.
Councillor, so the direction, what we have before us is simply a receiving of this report. I understand that in the report, it suggests a a further step. But I don't want us to set up for us to be doing a whole pile of committee work on the floor at council. I'm looking, Mr. Hayward's giving me the high sign, so he may have an idea for us. So I'd rather us figure out a go-forward position and maybe some steps forward on this prior to arguing about it extensively on the floor of
Yeah,
council.
and sorry, I did take a little tangent there, but if you will allow me, my one concern is that if we go forward with an RFP, which will be maybe 5 to 7 years, if we don't provide direction to get some community advertising out of this RFP, then we will lose that opportunity in some of the very fine sites that we have right now. So what I would hope to have gotten 2.5 years ago won't happen for another couple terms on council. So that would be a great loss. So I'm happy to.
Let's hear from Mr. Hayward on this matter, if you could.
Just through the chair, there's a couple of comments that were made that I have a little bit of concern about when terms like bungling the analysis is used. From an administration point of view, that causes me a lot of concern. I'd prefer those terms not be used through the chair. But that being said, when we look at the request for proposal, there are two aspects. Maximize the amount of revenue generated by billboard advertising, which we intend to do. And then there's almost a contrary thing where you are allowed to use the billboard advertising for free for community groups and for city purposes, which is fine. We can try and balance those two pieces out and talk to the councillor a few times about it. There are some other options that we had, which was we would actually own and build the billboards, but then we'd have to sell the advertising. That is not a competency that we have in this organization. We'd either have to build it or do something very different that would take a fair bit of time to build up. But basically, the RFP piece is what we're gearing for, and it really is to maximize the revenue. The one thing that the council has indicated, which we've talked about this as well, is the narrowing down of the focus to the existing 8 properties that we have. And I can understand where he's coming from that, because if you really want to build a network of billboards and so on, then it may warrant looking at a few more sites. And as he indicated, there are a number of areas where these have been scoped down for various reasons. The purpose of what we're trying to do from this point in administration is actually get the RFP out and get going, at least with a concept point for the existing sites. We can add in those other sites, so we're not necessarily stuck to the 8 in the future, but if we want to go back and add in as many other sites and challenge on those other sites, that is going to take some time. And if you want to hold up the whole RFP for that purpose, then that's council's choice. But if you want us to proceed with the RFP for these 8 sites and then indicate in that RFP there's potential for other sites that we could work towards, because, you know, we can challenge the rationale for taking some of those sites out, as was indicated. That's not an issue. Again, I think we should be challenged on some of those things. But I think moving this forward is the most important piece. We're heading, I think, given your prior direction, in the right direction. And it's just how do we balance off the freebie advertising from leasing the land or leasing the sites out.
I just ask one point of clarification. The report mentions the 2 CN sites that currently have public availability. We're expanding those CN sites, if I'm not corrected. We're adding other potential with CN.
With the new sign bylaw, there is a potential for more sites to become available, to become open for that purpose.
And they would have the same dual opportunity, public and private.
There is the potential for that within the bylaw.
Yeah, okay. I'd actually like to, if we do have motion on this, I'd like to encapsulate that's part of what we would intend. Okay. I'm going to look to the committee. You've heard the councillor's comments. You've heard city manager's comments. So, okay, Councillor Usher and then Councillor Park. I just wasn't sure if this.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm quite prepared to move the recommendation. You know, one of the things that I'm not trying to influence my colleagues in how they handle this, but we pay our staff a good money to go over these things, and I think that if we're going to overturn something that they come up with, even though we had a recommendation before, we need to be very, very careful with that. And from what I read from this report, I think that the staff did a good job in going through the process, and it seems to me that if we want to expand this in the future, we could. But I think that this RFP is very, very important to go at this time. So I agree with Mr. Hayward. We have to be careful with our languages that we use to our staff, because they're not our enemies. We're supposed to work together, and I'll be damned if I'm going to accuse them of not doing a good job, whichever language we want to do, because I respect the work that they do. I want them to know this. If I don't agree with them, I'm going to ask some questions, and I have an opportunity to vote against it. But in this particular case, I'm going to move the motion and vote in favor of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to thank Mr. Hayward for his comments about, you know, we can move forward with what we have today and then look for further opportunities in the future. I think the intention behind that was to say to the ward councillor that brought this issue forward to us from the outset was that we're not done. Things are still going to happen and progress. It's just a matter of, are we going to put everything on a shelf for the sake of expanding, or are we going to go forward with what we have now? So with that, I'm happy to second the staff recommendation and look for further opportunities in the future.
Others? Okay, briefly, Councillor.
Thank you very much. And just to address the language, yes, allow me to, I think a mistake was made in the numbers. For me to use the word bungled was, I want to apologize, but, you know, I did say that on purpose because, you know, this has been going on a long time for me, so I'm a little emotionally attached to it. However, I will say that that's inappropriate, right? It's not something I want to do, and so then again, sorry for that. And thanks to the committee for your consideration here. I'm sorry you'll be hearing from me a couple more times today, perhaps, but thank you.
Okay. It has been moved and seconded. I would suggest perhaps, Councillor, you can think of, if you want to encapsulate some language for an addition at council that would deal with a future exploration of those sites, that would be appropriate at that time. Okay, I'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, item number 4, I'm not, Councillor Usher, did you pull 4? Yeah. Electronic procurement solutions for solicitation of bids for city procurement.
My question is a very simple one. Now that I think about it, it's not very difficult. Where we talk, help me understand that this is a 3-year and then a 1+1. It's not a 1 and then a 1+1, right?
And through the chair, yes, that is correct. It is a 3-year with 2 one-year extensions added on at the end.
And that's, so you just added the word extension, because if you had the extension in here, I would have read it that way. But the way it's read, it almost sounds as though it could be a 1-year in the first instance and then a 1+1. But I even had the question here, do you mean extensions? So perhaps when we write this up somewhere, we could just add the word extension in B. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to congratulate the staff for using the word procurement both as a noun and as an adjective in the same sentence. I think that's quite remarkable. But also, I think this is a very significant step forward in our procurement, because this will eliminate some of the glitches we've had with proponents that are where all of the best intents have been happen and someone has missed a little ticky box, and because of missing a ticky box, that proponent is eliminated from the bid process, and it's always felt to me to be not meeting the highest standard of fairness, and I think this is a good move forward. So, Councillor Helmer, you had something else?
Yeah, I'm glad to see us move to an electronic procurement system. I was actually surprised that, I guess people could deliver things on paper and in big bundles, but I just thought that a lot of this stuff was electronic already, so. I'm glad that we're moving to that kind of platform. I'm a little confused about the financial impact section, so I'm looking at page 18 of the package. It says there's no cost to the City of London for the service, and then it talks about how we get revenue, and I just wonder if our staff could explain that to me. I think maybe I just don't understand how procurement software works as a business model itself, because somebody's paying for it, so I'm just wondering who's paying.
Through the chair. So the way this works is the company that we will be procuring through the eSolutions actually has the network that vendors, potential vendors that do business with multiple organizations in multiple cities actually purchase a subscription directly through eSolutions to be able, so similar to Bid and Go, where they pay an amount, they have access to the system and all of the bid opportunities as part of that. So that's where the revenue component goes directly. So the city doesn't pay for the software. We have a contract with the provider to provide that on our behalf and is networked and accessed through the City of London, but essentially the vendors that are looking for the bid opportunities have a subscription. So what this does is, because they have many contracts with a lot of other municipalities as well, it actually kind of limits in some ways the cost to the vendors with having multiple organizations, because if they're typically doing business with the City of London, they might have a fee, but they also have ability to access all the procurements with the other organizations that they are signed on to their software. With respect to the city's budget, the city also currently today through Bid and Go, if someone wishes to purchase a copy of the documents without having to go through the system, we would sell those, and there's a cost for that through the city's procurement office. So there's two components to that, that if they wanted to access them directly and have a paper copy, they would pay a fee and we would be able to provide that. And those are all through our fees and charges in the bylaw.
Okay, it's been moved, it's been seconded. Call the question. All in favor?
Closing the vote and the motion carries 5-0.
Item number 4, Councillor Usher, Federation of Canadian Municipalities, Green Municipal Fund Study.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, we have a situation here where this is a multi-community program, and it seems as though everything is being done from London, from what I gather here. And if that is so, then the 9%, which is the $16,000, is based on our time. So it says in-kind staff value. So could you help me, through you, Mr. Chair? Are we getting $160,000 from the GMF fund? And help me understand, it says GMF grant for the $88,000. The other 10% from each of the cities, is that a grant also? I'm looking really on page 22. I'm just trying to get some clarification of the dollars, how much dollars we are actually getting, and whether the $16,000 is $16,000 plus another $16,000.
Mr. Henderson.
Through the chair. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we have S2E representative here, Derek Satnick, who's the expert and made the original FCM proposal submission and works very closely with them. We also have a Sierra representative from Sierra here as well. So the in-kind portion is an estimate, and it all depends on how much work we actually have to undertake. We have a lot of the work already done through policy review and development reviews and zoning regulations and building code reviews. So we have a lot of that data already. It just has never been collected under one package. The other municipalities are in the very early stages, and that's why the City of London took the lead. So to speak to your financial question, I'll turn it over to Mr. Satnick.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Henderson, too. Yeah, the project is kind of a 2-3-year-old idea at this point that's been negotiated among the 4 city partners. Your staff have been very helpful all the way through this process, and we actually met through Sifton's property, the West 5 project, which is one of the 2 local sites that are participating. I'm sure you probably noticed in the appendix, there's actually 8 projects that are happening, 2 in each city, And the two city sites, the two London sites are the Sierra property at McCormick and the West 5 property by Sifton. The West 5 property of the 8 is by far the farthest along, which is why the City of London is the lead applicant on this project. But the project itself has a federal scope. It's through the Green Municipal Fund and intended as a federal effort. So the 4 cities in Ontario that are all participating in this are participating as equal financial partners. They're all putting in the same amount of money, and they're all putting in the same amount of in-kind effort. And that effort's reflected in things like committee meetings where the 4 cities are participating together on teleconference calls and exchanging emails and such to coordinate all the effort of just keeping informed, basically, while really the bulk of the work is being done by us and our partners, by S2E and other external partners working on the properties. So I hope that answers your question. The in-kind contribution represents staff time spent in these committee meetings or on emails and phone calls. The actual cash contribution is the other numbers, the 9,000.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate it, Mr. Chair. This is, whenever I hear about GMF fund, I always get excited because I figure that of this 50 million plus that FCM has to dole out, that we should be really getting some. And it's not often for a big amount of money like that. I noticed that a lot of other places are getting a lot of the money. So I'm so glad that when we could get some. So if you have more projects, just bring them forward. I'd like to see a little bit more of that. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the explanation. I appreciate it.
If there's no other comments, well, can we get it moved and seconded? Go ahead, Councillor Helmer.
Yeah, I'm delighted to see this coming forward. I know that Sifton has really been out front on net zero development in the private sector in Ontario in particular. But I'm glad to see that there's 2 sites in London and that one of them is the redevelopment of the McCormick factory site. I'm glad. I know that Sierra was working to try and get some assistance through FCM and the Green Municipal Fund. I'm glad that that's actually coming together. That's great.
Okay. Anything else? I'll call the question. Moved and seconded.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to item number 6, which is the industrial land development strategy. Councillor, you pulled that as well. It's a good report. Go ahead.
Well, it's a good report. It's almost a perfect report, as a matter of fact, Mr. Chair. I just have a few questions. Whenever I see something like this, you know, recently we've been beginning to think way out in the future. And every time something comes up with a piece of land, we always say, well, this piece of land might be required for high-speed rail and so on. So I want to know if in all this context, we've thought about things like potential of high-speed rail passing through London, whether or not some of these locations might be required for it. I don't want us to put a big building up and all of a sudden we find that, geez, you know, we could have used this for high-speed rail and we knew it was coming. But I'm thinking about high-speed rail. I'm also thinking in terms of the LTC. And just what came into my mind, there are lots of other things. But when I think about the LTC, I think of 2 things. I think of the potentiality of them at one point in time having to move from Highbury and or needing another site. And when I read this, somewhere down on Highbury, close to the 401, you've got about 5 acres down there, according to this report. I thought to myself, geez, you know, maybe this type of thing would be worth the while for things like that. And I also think, and I know that there are people here from Western Fair, and I don't get involved with their business, but I wonder if at some point in time Western Fair might say, well, we could use another site out there for whatever else that they're thinking of expanding for. Because just because they have that piece of land right in the middle there, doesn't mean that, and they have lots of agricultural initiative and all that type of things, whether they may need land somewhere. I'm just throwing it out.
So let's see if we can
get
get some answers to the
that's what I'm saying,
question
Mr.
one at a time. Mr. Warner.
Through the chair, in regards to Councillor Usher's question on high-speed rail, the report outlines the status of the current city-owned municipal industrial parks. We have abundance of serviced shovel-ready land. We're extensively marketing and with the assistance of LEDC looking for prospective site selectors for those sites. None of those sites really would have any use for a location suitable for high-speed rail. There is some rail connections, and we do liaison with CP and CN to ensure that if we do have a general industrial type of purchaser, that there may be potential accessibility to the rail corridors. But as far as high-speed rail, none of the city-owned industrial lands would have any use or bearing for those future corridors. As I understand, they would run where the existing corridor runs through the central of the city at this stage, but there is an ongoing EA, and we'll monitor that as well. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand how to answer your second question with respect to expansion opportunities for somebody like the Western Fair. The city-owned industrial lands, specifically even the future serviceable industrial lands, they fit into the strategy of creating employment opportunities for the city and new industry, and those are being retained and designed, planned, and will be hopefully marketed for the sale for new industrial users.
Thank you for the answer. Let's forget about Western Fair. I just threw that in because I wanted to intimidate my friends here from Western Fair a little bit. Let me address the high-speed rail first. My understanding is that it's very possible the high-speed rail could very well run along the 401. I can't see high-speed rail coming right in the center of our city. So that's where my dreams are, my future thinking is thinking of. So I'm not going to dispute what you just said. I'm just saying that just because we have rail lines today doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that the high-speed rail will follow, because one of the things that I heard, it may very well go along the 401. Whether it's going to go along the 401 through London, I don't know that. But the other thing that I mentioned was when I read the report, and I think of the problems that we had with finding a piece of land when we needed to expand the LTC a few years ago, I'm just thinking that, are we sure that none of these parcels might be utilized for that? If we ever need it, because I can't see us just continuing without expansion for the LTC, especially when we start going high-speed rail. Now, maybe they haven't even thought about this. I'm just asking the question now so that if it needs to get into somebody's ears, it's there. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all I was saying.
Thank you. So probably not surprising that I wanted to talk about this one today, since I think I talked about it a lot last year. And I remember last year when we were talking about this, we were facing a situation where we had only sold, I think, 21 acres of industrial land, and there was some criticism about whether our land development strategy was working. And at the time, I had asked, I think, Mr. Warner about how it was going in 2016. And the answer was, because we got this report halfway through 2016, it was going very well. In fact, 2016 was tracking to be a very, very good year. And it turns out to be, it's one of the fourth best years since we've been looking at this from 2001 in terms of volume sold. The amount of money we've sold or the amount of land that we've sold has not only gone up, but what's important is the amount of investment on that land has certainly jumped in a significant way as well. So, and for me, that's an important signal as well, not just buying the land, but actually the investment in the constructions on the facilities and in the City of London to create the jobs, but to create that infrastructure and that capital that sits here. And that's really the goal of the land strategy. It's not just to buy it and sell it, but to have something go on it that is going to be productive and is a significant investment in London. So I'm really glad to see this report. I'll say I'm happy that you squeezed on another year rather than dropping off a year. I like to see that. I know eventually that'll be a hard thing to do as we keep going. But when I looked at the reports year over year, I think this is a really good news story on the way that the strategy is going. And I hope that this year is going as good as last year went at this point. The only thing I'll ask, when I was comparing the reports back and forth, I noticed between last year and this year's report, the 2011 and 2012, there certainly isn't any industrial land missing, but it was kind of reallocated in this report from 2011 to 2012. And I assume that that's just a regular routine review of what year these things landed in and how they were allocated. It's the exact numbers. So here in the current report, it says 93.35 and 18.55 when you look at 2011, 2012 respectively. Last year it was 101.35 and 10.55. So those numbers actually work out when you shift them. I'm just wondering, is that a regular occurrence to go back through and see what years these actually ended up landing in or when the deals closed? Or is that just a correction from the past? It was just a curiosity question on my part.
Mr. Warner?
Through the chair, yes, we do go back and look at the historical records. We report out on what we have under contract and what has closed in that year. And so there is, in some years, you might have a sale that's later in the year and it doesn't close till the next year. So that actually the next year gets the benefit for the reporting purposes.
Great, thank you. And again, great work, I think, on our staff and everybody involved in the strategy. Great numbers to kind of back up the strategy, and not only the city-owned strategy, but I'm glad to see the uptick in private-owned industrial land sales as well. And it's nice to be able to track that. The link to jobs, I think, is valuable. I know that's a very difficult thing to actually do because I think it's based on the announcements, and exactly what that ends up being over the long term is difficult. So that's not really the number that I tend to focus on in this report, because I know that, you know, we want to be cautious about that. But the amount of acreage we sell, the amount of investment on that acreage, and the amount of sales that we've made and how that tracks over time, I think is very important. And I do recognize, I think as we all should, when you look at that long-term chart, this is an area that has good years and bad years, investment at times, and then it takes some time to gather that investment. So it seems like we're on an uptick right now, and so that's great for the strategy. But it is one of those strategies that you have to hold for, you know, in the long run. And I think that the data you provide in this report really shows the advantage of sticking with the strategy through, you know, the valleys and the hills. So great work on our staff. I'll be interested to hear what my colleagues say as well.
Councilor Helmer, did you want to speak to this?
I sure do, and I think I have some questions for Mr. Warner through the chair. And the issue that I'm having is the pricing, and we have these reports which are getting better and better, I must say. They're very helpful and give, I think, a good overview of what's going on in the industrial land market in London, and sort of how successful we've been over the years on that front with the industrial parks. At the end of the report, in one of the appendices, there's a good chart that kind of shows what are other municipalities marketing their lands at in terms of pricing. And we've had those, that appendix gets updated every year, and we've had it over multiple reports. And so one thing I did was I went back to look at one of the old ones to see, okay, so what have the other municipalities been doing with their sort of advertised price for industrial land? And we have been holding steady for quite some time. Right, we've been keeping it pretty steady. We've not been increasing at all. Many of the other municipalities in that list have been increasing the price, the marketed price of industrial land, quite substantially. So some of them are doing the similar thing that we are, which is keeping it flat. Other ones are increasing it. And I just wonder if Mr. Warner could speak to that, because, you know, I know the value of land is going to go up over time, generally speaking. We're still selling it for $75,000 an acre. And I just wonder if you speak to us, at what point would we consider increasing? Why are we not increasing when we're seeing other similar municipalities increasing?
Mr. Warner?
Yep, through the chair. So we've established the council-approved pricing based on being competitive, based on the amount of supply and demand, but also recognizing fair market value. So we do benchmark appraisals. We have qualified appraisers on staff. We also hire independent consultants to test our prices as well. We look at offering prices, we look at the private sector prices, and without a doubt, the city as a municipality is, through the strategy, putting out the lands at a very competitive price in comparison to the local privately owned lands. And when we do study the marketing prices of other municipalities versus actual, they're not the same. Similar to here, it's an asking price essentially, and there's a negotiation and there's conditions associated with each of those deals. And we are tracking our local competitors. I won't name them, but they're definitely coming in at much lower prices than they're asking. So I feel comfortable in advising you that the prices that you're receiving are fair market value. That's in compliance to your overall policy with respect to land, and they are being competitive overall in Southwestern Ontario.
Councillor, anything further?
Yeah, so I hear what you're saying, Mr. Warner, and I guess, you know, this is not, it's a bit of an odd market in the sense that, you know, there's a number of municipalities that are doing something similar to what we're doing, which is they are, I don't know if they're all servicing them, but they're marketing these industrial land parcels all over the region. And they're advertising the prices out, and I don't think they're all as sophisticated as we are in terms of keeping track of what everyone else is doing, but we have a huge percentage of the market in the sense that, like if you look at the numbers in terms of serviced land and unserviced land, the City of London, just on our own, like we have 20% of all the land, right? So a lot of the municipalities like Hamilton or, you know, some of the bigger ones that are more built out, you know, they don't have a lot of land on offer that's serviced. So they have high prices, but they have no land available. Whereas we have quite a lot of land available, a lot more than many of the municipalities around us, much more than other municipalities. And so in that sense, like, I know that we could sell for the prices we're selling at now, and that I would agree that it's fair market value. But we have some ability to kind of set the market price by saying, listen, we own this land and we're gonna sell it fast or slow. And if we wanna contract the supply and sell it for more, we probably can. And so I just wonder if you could speak to that piece, which is, you know, we have a certain kind of price setting ability in the market. I know we're only 20%, but that's still a significant chunk.
Through the chair, raising very good, valid points. Essentially, I'm emphasizing the competitiveness that we're trying to demonstrate. We deal with a lot of inquiries. In fact, you don't see as many inquiries as we deal with, and that's the competitive nature of it. We're competing with other municipalities that may not have as large a shovel-ready land bank, but they do have land, and some of those municipalities are closer to the GTA or have other locational attributes that the site selectors are looking for. And so what we are finding is our local market is very healthy. We're retaining our current industry. There's lots of expansion. They're happy with the location of our sites. We've established, I think, a fair price in the median of the range of the other municipalities, but we are trying to maintain a competitiveness. And to enhance this, if I could ask for Kapil from the LADC to also speak to his experience in how competitive it is and how we're marketing these lands as well.
Mr. Lakosha, would you like to speak to this?
Sure, thank you very much. Through the chair, further to Mr. Warner's comments, the landscape in Southwestern Ontario is in fact quite competitive. Outside of Kitchener-Waterloo, when you start traveling west, a number of municipalities have seen the success London has had since 2001 in land development. In fact, as early as last week, Woodstock has been planning on developing more of their sites in that corridor. As more inventory comes on the market, there's certainly a downward pressure on pricing. And you've heard similar comments on competitiveness when it relates to development charges or industrial tax ratios and a variety of other things. So really, we have to look at the holistic landscape for municipally owned and serviced industrial sites in Southwestern Ontario, outside of Hamilton, Kitchener, and so on. And that's where this chart reflects some of the inventory. I should also stress that it's a bit of a moving target because throughout the year, these inventory numbers don't stay static. So communities have a larger land mass, but as they're making sales and transactions, those numbers get adjusted accordingly.
Yeah, so interesting discussion. I was looking at the supply of service land, and in fact, the supply has really tightened a lot. I just looked at 2014 as a sort of base year. At that time, there was 1,700 hectares, give or take, or acres, I think it's in acres, available, serviced in all these municipalities that we were talking about. Now, there's only something like 1,300. So, that's not a small decrease in supply, it's a pretty significant decrease in supply. And at least when you look at the marketed prices that have been, I think it's actually really helpful to have the range, the sort of lower bound and the upper bound that have been put out. There've been significant increases across a number of these municipalities. I'll just give some examples. Like Windsor has increased their price, their marketed price by 15% from 2014. And now Windsor, is close to the US, but it's pretty far from Toronto. Brantford has increased their marketed price by 66%, right? And so, I would imagine that, like if it's a normal market, as the supply is decreasing, the economy is improving, the demand is increasing, I see a lot of people increasing their marketed price, and I'm wondering why are we not, I'm not saying we need to crank it up a lot, but are we not recognizing that there's some price appreciation that probably should be happening? I look back in the old report that used to list off all the sales. I notice it's not in this report anymore, but it is in some of the older reports. And we were selling land for $74,000 an acre back in 2001. It's just a couple sales, but there were sales at that level, and they're relatively small parcels. So I'm not sure, and I'm just expressing this, I don't think we need to make a change for this year, but I do think that, at some point, we're gonna have to move off of 75,000 as the upper limit for the marketed price. I looked at the MPAC results for their evaluations of industrial properties, and they're saying it's going up about 2% a year. That's properties with buildings on them. But 2% a year seems pretty reasonable. And what I'm wary of is if we keep it at 75,000 for too long, then we'll have a big jump up when we're trying to catch up to the rest of the market, and that might send a bad signal at that particular time. So I appreciate the discussion. I'm not personally convinced that this necessarily is the right marketing price to be putting out there. I think you're losing me a little bit on that one, but I don't think we need to make a change this year because on the actual sales, we're getting good value.
Okay, if someone could move and second the motion, that would be helpful. If I may comment, I think the other piece of it is, I'm sorry. The other piece of it, from my perspective, is it's kind of going back to intro economics. It's this, how sensitive is the purchase of the land to the pricing? And I would, in one sense, like to see greater occupancy, if I could use that, so that we have more ongoing cash flow through the tax base. And so when a plant is built or a facility is built, we receive more revenue on a year-to-year basis because of the taxation on that. And that's above and beyond the economic impact in terms of the jobs that are created and those sorts of things. The other thing I've noticed in the 401 corridor that has become quite, and I have to ask the question, and I don't know the answer to the question, I'm not looking for an answer today, is what is in all those logistics warehouses? I mean, I look at Halton Hills and I'm going, my goodness, if like, that is a phenomenal amount of square footage. I mean, hundreds of thousands of square feet of logistics warehouses, so I'm sure it's underutilized. We're looking for, as we know, the employment per square foot, if I could put it that way, in the logistics industry is quite low. The number of jobs that are created from that, that's not our highest, most intense use for that. We have outstanding examples in our community that create far more economic impact than logistics warehouses. And so, I think that's where the sensitivity comes. And London is unique in its geography and its proximity to the US border and the GTHA, and it's balancing that off. Councillor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for recognizing me. And I used to always say psst to you in committee, and you never used to hear me before, so thanks for hearing me. I want to touch on a couple of things, a couple of comments that have been made and see how they're tied together. I know Councillor Morgan talked about the jobs that are created and that it's hard to really make that direct link. But I think when we look at the employment report that we also received and then the number of jobs that have been created in the last few months, the two reports go very well together. And when we're talking about industrial land and the kinds of advanced manufacturing jobs that go with these industrial land sites, we see that they're the good kind of jobs. They're well-paying jobs, and as Councillor Hubert, as the chair pointed out, we want those kinds of jobs on these sites. So that leads me to my question about serviced land, fully serviced land versus we also have a supply of land that has not yet been serviced. So when we talk about warehousing activities as an example, they don't necessarily, it's my understanding, that there isn't a requirement necessarily for fully serviced land for that kind of purpose. And so if we are spending the money on servicing this land, I'm wondering, do we try, when we get interest from a company that wants to set up a warehouse as an example, do we try to direct them to the unserviced land that we have in our inventory, rather than having them set up shop on their service land? We might be better served by waiting for a more advanced manufacturing type of industry to set up there.
Yep, through the chair, just to clarify, the service land is essentially our showcase marketed shovel-ready land. We are definitely targeting the targeted sectors and the light industrial. It's not really meant for the logistic type industry. We would prefer to work with them and putting them on other locations, whether it be private or look for other sites. The purpose, the strategy with the inventory of unserviced lands is our bank, our land bank for our future service lands. So it's a sort of a staged approach because it takes so much time and resources to plan, design, and then develop your subdivision or develop your lands with servicing, stormwater management facilities, et cetera. We're trying to keep ahead of the competition by offering a good land bank that we're working on, and that's the intent of our unserviced lands. But we would not want to lose a logistics company. We would work with them on trying to showcase them other preferred sites that not necessarily using our high invested shovel-ready sites.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I know we would prefer that, but it has happened, is that we have sold our service land to logistics companies. Is that the case? Has that happened in the past?
Through the chair, yes, in the past there have been some cases. It's really hard to make a general statement around an industry. It's really treated on a case-by-case basis. Many of the newer distribution centers have a degree of processing or advanced manufacturing or further value add, as it's called in the industry as well. So really, it's all dependent on employment, their servicing needs as well. If it's just a dry use that doesn't require any water, sewer capacity, it's treated differently. So really, on a case-by-case basis, you'd see in some of the previous industrial parks, there have been users that might be in that general segment, but are of an advanced nature that have a high employment and some of these other uses as described. Thank you.
Thank you, that's helpful. And I just want to make one more comment about the price comparison among municipalities, and sort of going back to what Councillor Helmer was saying. It might be useful in the future to include a column that says, if you have the information, what the land actually sells for in other municipalities, so we can compare if their marketing is actually doing them any justice. If they're selling for much less than what they're marketing for, then it gives us a better indication of what the real competitiveness is.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. I'm going to call the question on it.
Sorry, I just
call
got
the question on it.
No, I'm not voting. I just wanted to add one more thing, because I think this has been a great discussion and a lot of great points raised by the colleagues. I did want to touch back on the jobs thing. My comment on the jobs was not because we're overinflating them. It's more of an underestimation. Basically, we're writing down the number of jobs that are announced at the announcement, not accounting for the spin-offs, the economic activity, and all of those other components of job creation that goes when you have industrial activity in a city. And so my caution on the jobs numbers was that they're probably low and not high. So I just wanted to make sure that was very clear. And I also wanted to comment to say that the land strategy, and I know we talk about this every year, industrial land development strategy is one component of the way that we engage in the industrial sector. We also have a CIP, we also have our tax rate policy, and quite frankly, on the tax rate policy, the average increase has been -3+ for the past few years on tax ratios and tax rates for the industrial class. We've made some adjustments to the way that the CIP program will work. And so any sort of change to the pricing, obviously, I know that we would look at in conjunction with all of the other levers that are being used within the industrial land development and job creation strategy that we have. So I think a great discussion by my colleagues, certainly part of, I think, a larger discussion about economic activity in the industrial sector in the city.
Okay, I'm going to call a question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, turning to the Western Fair and City of London lease agreement and their intention to demolish the building at 316. Mr. Warner, is this your file as well? Sorry.
Yes, through the chair, I can.
Can you give us just sort of a quick overview and just what the scope is here and what, you know, sort of who's on first and what's on second?
Yes, through the chair, happy to do so. So the council, the city and the council and Western Fair Board and staff have worked towards a long-term ground lease that was ratified in early 2016. And within that ground lease, which governs the use of the lands and how it operates, in a structure of the ground lease included a lease oversight committee where we have representatives of both the Western Fair administration and city to discuss matters that relate to the leasing of the land. And I'll remind you that the land, for the most part, is 50% tenants in common ownership between the two parties. So the city has a 50% ownership right in the land, and then there's different ratios of ownership as it relates to the buildings. In this particular instance, the Western Fair has addressed the Lease Oversight Committee with an intent to remove or demolish their head office building at 316 Rectory. On that particular property, the city is a 50% tenant in common owner of the land, but has no interest whatsoever in the building, as in an ownership interest. So under the provisions of the ground lease then, there's an obligation on behalf of the Western Fair Association to indicate their intent, their plans, and there is an opportunity through the lease for the city council and the city staff to comment on those plans. So we're bringing to you an information report and an opportunity to comment on the Western Fair's intent. They've indicated the intent and the rationale for that in a letter dated April 21st, and I have asked one of the representatives, Mr. Reg Ash is here, if you have any specific questions for them with regards to the intent to remove that building.
Thank you, that's helpful, and City Council's never short on comments, so I'll turn to my colleagues. Councillor Usher.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I read the report and I think I understood everything that is said here, but I do have a few, I'll say, questions or concerns. I have to be careful because I'm not so sure I'm allowed to ask these questions, but I'll ask it and you could tell me. When I think about the Western Fair and I think of this large property, what I'm hearing is that Western Fair needs this location for additional parking. And I think of all the activities that happens there throughout the year, different times, and I think of the future potential for what will be happening there over the years. We know as well what some of those are. But I just wonder if there's a vast amount of land for ground surface parking. And if this land is needed for parking, has there been any discussions or potential for multi-level parking on the site in a whole to accommodate some of this parking rather than have this vast expanse of land to be used in surface parking?
Through the chair, Mr. Usher. Excuse me. We have looked at multi-level parking, but it seems to be cost prohibitive in nature. And the long-term costs of maintaining that are something that we haven't considered to be feasible.
Go ahead.
Okay, and I can appreciate that. I'm not going into the details of that. It does concern me that we can't utilize it for that, especially when you have expansion of other things in the area. We know exactly some of those thoughts about use of other things such as the casino and things like that. So, Mr. Chair, through you, so we're going to eliminate this building. It's a nice looking building from outside, but I agree with you, inside it's probably tired and there's not a whole lot you could do with it if you want to go into the future with it. But it seems to me that that Western Fair will still need a place for its administrative office. And I'm not going to ask you where you're going to put that or what. My concern is that BRT is passing through there along King Street. And I know that this land is a block away, this particular parking lot, but we have to look at all of Western Fair. And I don't want them to be planning something on both sides of King Street if we are going to need that. And I'm talking about potential relocation of the administration building. That's what I'm thinking in my mind. I just don't want anything around there to be interfering with BRT passing through that location. May I ask through you, Mr. Chair, if Western Fair has given any consideration with respect to, in view of any parking expansion that they might be doing with respect to BRT passing through there along King Street, and is it Ontario Street is the other one? They're turning Ontario Street, I believe.
So is there anything with respect to this report and your future plans that would impede BRT?
Through the chair, if I could just see if I could help first and then turn it to Reg, but to our understanding, the BRT corridor you indicated would be on the King Street section, and the Western Fair does own 100% of the lands on the north side of King Street. And Mr. Ash can confirm that at this stage they have no development plans for that block of land. So the lands where 316 Rectory, the building sits, to my understanding, there is no corridor planning for BRT, and so there wouldn't be any impacts associated, and they're not planning any redevelopment of that land. They're looking at utilizing it for parking.
And that sounds okay to me, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to be sure that they would have some potential thought of developing King Street. Somehow they're going to have an administration building somewhere. And this is not addressing it. And I'm not asking for that. I'm just saying that just in case they were thinking of that, I'd like to be sure that they have BRT in mind and come back to us with that. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Park?
Thank you, and being asked for our comments here, some comments. I recognize the idea behind wanting more parking, but I don't see any need for it, considering the amount of parking that's available on site, both at the BMO and also at Western Fair north of King Street. So I'm not in support of getting rid of this building at this time, recognizing that City Council can only give our opinion, so I've done that.
Just a question through the chair to our staff. It's noted in the report that the buildings are listed on the inventory of heritage resources. So I imagine the regular planning process would apply in terms of seeking a demolition permit and then having Latch consider that request.
Through chair, that's correct. So we did a circulation and we've sought comments, including those from the heritage planner. They've indicated that there has been archaeological studies done to date and that it is registered as a historical heritage cemetery site, and definitely the proponent, the applicant, Western Fair, would have to follow all the requisite approval processes, including going through the permit application and dealing with whatever conditions are associated with that process.
Thank you. My second question, I think, is perhaps for Reg. This is the CN South Main Line that's directly adjacent to the site. That is the corridor that's been identified by the province as potentially where they're going to put high-speed rail, adjacent to the freight line that's there now. It seems as though what you have envisioned is some kind of partnership with the BMO Center, which is on the other side of the tracks. And have you, if the high-speed rail does go through there, there may be property takings, there will be a different kind of grade separation probably, if you have a high-speed train coming through. Have you thought through all of those things in terms of your long-term vision for that site as a parking lot?
Through the chair. We have struck a partnership with the BMO Center for a single show each year in March, and we haven't taken time to evaluate the impacts of the province's high-speed rail.
In terms of my comments on the site, it will be no surprise to anybody that I don't like the idea of demolishing buildings to build surface parking lots. That's true downtown, it's true in Old East Village. Surface parking is one of the worst uses of land in the core of the city that you can imagine. And this is an area that has all kinds of great things going on, but it also has a humongous amount of surface parking existing. The utilization of parking, you know, they're designed to handle these peak periods where there's a huge amount of cars that show up all at once. And the rest of the time it's just an empty parking field that's bad for the environment, it's bad for stormwater. Like, parking lots have a lot of downsides when they're not being used at their full capacity. I'm not convinced that the building needs to be demolished at all. I've been in the building a bunch of times and it seems like a perfectly fine building. I am concerned that if it gets demolished and turned into a surface parking lot, that redevelopment of that site will take a very, very long time. It's right near a rail corridor. It'll probably be a surface parking lot for decades. And I don't really like that idea. It's certainly up to the fair if they want to demolish the building and go through the regular planning process, but those are my comments on the idea of demolishing that building.
Okay, thank you. That was the old McCormick building at one time, so. I've been actually quite recently into the back bowels of that building, and it is worth an interesting tour. I can show you pictures of Bessie the cow, and there's very interesting artifacts back in that building. And I assume that anything of historic value would be conserved and used in any way possible. So, okay, thank you for your comments, councillors. Need a motion to receive this at this time. Call a question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 4-1.
Since we're marching through this, I'm just going to pause for one moment. You'll look on your added, if you could, to the item that was referred back from council, particularly dealing with EPAC that requires 6 additional members. The clerk has prepared the sheet, and they've asked if we would take a moment to rank our ballots and give it to them so that while we continue on through our meeting, they will do the calculation of that. Okay, Ms. Corman will do her magic. Someone will do their magic. So, clerk, could you distribute those? Councillor?
Thank you. So in an effort to avoid some of the issues we've had recently, I would like to suggest that before we do a ranked ballot, we take nominations and then we do the ranked ballot just on the people who've been nominated. What we have before us is a list of 12 people. We don't have to actually rank all of these people. We should just put forward the nominations. If there's more than 6 people who get nominated, then we can do a ranked ballot to figure out who should be in the 6. But I think at this point we should take nominations.
Okay.
It's one of the problems we've done in the past. We stopped doing that and it's problematic.
And here lies the rub with ranked ballots, is every time we intend to do this. There's a different methodology. It wasn't my intent to get into the process on this. My understanding was we were on a ranked ballot where we were doing 1 to 12. If the committee so desires to do a nomination process, that's fair enough. And if that's the will of the committee, then I will do that. I'll just make sure I'm on side with the clerk. Okay, so is that the will of the committee? Okay, so I've got at least 3 heads bobbing and 1. So I'll take nominations then. Councillor.
I'd like to nominate Subhashini Sivakumar, Marindi Desenge.
No, I'll take 1 nomination. Or are you going to give us a whole slate?
I was going to do a couple.
Okay.
Marinde Desenge and Christian Terrian.
Okay, that's 3. Okay. Councillor Park.
I apologize if Councillor Helmer made note of this name already, but Christian Terrian, did he say that already? Okay.
You did. So I have 3. We need 6. Councillor Morgan.
I will nominate Carol Dick, Berta Kitchener, and Edward Krynak.
Okay, Councillor Usher. Since we're feeling in the nominating way.
My problem is that I have the same 3 as.
That's okay. Is there any additional, so what
Well,
you,
I do have addition.
okay, so give me the ones that are not nominated so far.
Okay, so I'm gonna put the additional ones in because I have the same 3 as he has as my first, second, and third.
Can you use your mic, please?
Yeah, sorry.
That'd be.
I will add 2 because I have the same 3 as.
Yeah, just give me the 2 additional.
Okay, so, and probably one of them has already been, Christian Theria has already been added?
It's already in.
So what about, Subhashini? That's added?
We're great.
I'm done.
Perfect.
You have that one?
It's already in.
Okay, I'm not adding.
So we have 6 nominations. You can't nominate anybody. You can only ask someone to be a friend, and you can call a friend and they can nominate someone. Is there someone not on the list that you think should be on the list, Councilor?
I know Heather Bailey, and I think she'd be a tremendous candidate, so I'm just offering that to the committee.
Okay, Heather Bailey. Does anyone want to add that name to the list?
Sure, I'll add her. I'll always do my colleague a favor.
Okay. Just when I thought it was going to get easy, okay? Thanks, Michael. We appreciate that. Okay, so we have 7 individuals nominated. We now will need to rank ballot those. And please, there's 7 individuals, 1 to 7, please. 1 being your highest choice, and 7 being your lowest choice.
We're going to do a motion to put those nominations.
Okay, so I'm told I need a motion to close the nominations or to nominate. Okay, moved and seconded by Councillor Helmer and Councillor Park. call that question. Okay,
Closing the vote, motion carries 5-0.
so can we come back to the final tally then? Okay, so we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Let's move on to item number 8, which was the staff report. It's the only one that wasn't called, so I'll look for someone to move that. Call that question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Move to item number 9, which is our investment report. Councillor Helmer, did you pull that? Yeah, okay. You're up.
Okay, everybody buckle in. This is an exciting report. So first of all, I want to say I'm very excited that we've got the actual investment mix much, much closer to the policy targets. I know we discussed that last time. There was a commitment that it was going to get closer, and it's much, much closer. And then we made more money because it was closer and the yields are better in the medium term and the longer term category. So just glancing at it, it looks like it's about $1.5 million more just by adjusting the investment mix. That's a great news story. I did want to raise, and I have a question for our staff around that overall policy, those overall policy targets. And especially as we move to having more and more in reserve funds. So we're now up to $840 million, rounding off, in reserve funds. Looking at the list of investments that we're holding, we have something like $270 million in cash. And then a bunch of things that are basically cash. That is, many, many more millions of dollars on top of that. So we're at $400 million in cash or GICs. That is a lot of cash and GICs to be holding. And I understand that our sort of primary focus is liquidity and security of principal, and I get that. We're a city, we're not some kind of venture capital firm or something. But we give up yield if we're, and frankly, with the way rates are, we're kind of losing ground against inflation in a lot of these things, especially the huge amount of this in cash, right? So if I look at it on a sort of like a 10-year horizon, having an extra $50 million in cash at a totally nominal rate of return is really like losing money on $50 million, right? After inflation. So I'm concerned that the mix is not quite right. And I wonder if our staff would like to speak to that. It's one thing when we have, if we only had $250 million in investments, I can understand why we want to protect half of it for cash, because we have certain requirements on cash flow that we need to have things in cash. But now we're talking about $400 million average balance in cash. That's a lot. And some of these GICs are like 1-year terms, right? So these are very quickly available. And we're a very stable organization that doesn't get a lot of external shock. So I just wonder if our staff could speak to it. I'm not talking about taking it from 50% down to, 20, but should we look at maybe bringing it down to 45 or even 40 and redistributing some of that into the medium term, for example?
Through the chair, that's an excellent question there. Yeah, we are currently looking at actually our terms in terms of our targets. It has taken us a while to obviously achieve that target, and I think we've come a really long way if you look at it from a bigger perspective over the last 5 to 7 years. In terms of your specific question, yeah, we definitely are looking at that. We are definitely looking at potentially lowering the reserve fund target specifically in terms of what cash should be available. We're also looking at creating another section on the targets for beyond 10 years and breaking out kind of between 5 and 9 years. So these are things we're definitely looking at, and hopefully that will put us in a better position to pick up some additional yield.
Thank you. Could you give me a sense of the timeline for that? Is that something you think maybe is going to be coming forward next year, or is it something that's going to be out further in the future?
Through the chair, this is something we're currently in the process now of evaluating. It will likely be something that will come forward in early 2018.
Professor Morgan.
Thanks. I'll echo Councillor Helmer's comments on the matching the target. I think if we have a policy, we should be getting to it. I remember we had a good discussion about this last year, and that's great work to align with the target. On the comment about the adjusting the policy about the short, medium, and long term, I'm certainly happy to discuss that. But I do notice that when you look at the spreads that you get across the short and medium terms, there are some very good rates even in the short term. And so I certainly wouldn't want our policy to restrict us from chasing the best rate, particularly on a shorter term should it become available. So I think in that policy review, certainly the short-term opportunities at good rates are ones that we don't want to preclude by having a policy that's too rigid in the long term. I think what we're trying to avoid from a liquidity perspective is, locking ourselves in for too long. Locking ourselves in for shorter at good rates is okay. Obviously, in a changing interest rate market, we would have to, look at our strategy in a slightly different way than this long-term low interest rate position that we've been in. But I think the policy review is certainly warranted, and obviously it has to be flexible for those sorts of opportunities, and which is why I'm not too afraid of skewing too far from the policy. But I think in the past we've seen it as a fairly dramatic veer away from our plan. And as long as that's for good reason, I think that's, some flexibility that needs to be built into the policy. So there's obviously risk and reward to this, and I think balancing the right risk and reward is really important because, as Councillor Helmer mentioned, even the slight shift year over year led to, lots of extra money coming into the city coffers, which defers the amount of debt we have to have, which offsets tax increases, which does all the good things that we want our money to work hard for. So, or I should say not our money, but the taxpayers' money to work in the best possible way for them. So, thank you.
Okay, any further comment on that issue? Councillor Helmer?
Okay, my second question is about the changes that are coming to the Municipal Act to allow cities to invest in a wider range of securities. It's not totally clear to me exactly what the parameters are going to be. It seems that it's much more permissive. And do we need to make adjustments to our investment policy to sort of rein ourselves in a bit more now that regulation is going to be more permissive? And are there actually opportunities there where we could do things that we wanted to do, but we've been prevented to by the regulations? I just wonder where our staff are at on that.
I'll start if Jason has anything else to add. Through the chair, so right now the province is looking at, and they have consulted actually with a large number of municipalities to get some feedback on as they're crafting the regulations. So without the regulation, it's hard at this point to be able to determine whether we have to update our policies, but certainly that's something in the back of our minds that we suspect that we'll be looking at that to see if there are any amendments. Obviously, when that comes forward, there will be a broader range of things that there are some opportunities that we can look at. And certainly we know they're working towards that. And we believe possibly we'll hear more before the end of 2017. But they're certainly working with us, and we've provided feedback to them in terms of some of the things that could be considered. And we're waiting right now to see what that first iteration will look like. But certainly right now, we don't necessarily have to change the investment policy, but it may be prudent to do so once we see what that comes forward.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the other comments being made. I look at one investment, it's a global asset management, and I imagine that we're investing our money for the benefit of people around the globe, and I'm wondering if there's things, is there a way for us to have some of these investments benefit the City of London, in which case I'd be willing to accept sometimes maybe a smaller interest rate, but I don't know if we can channel that some way to this city.
Through the chair, the specific investment that the councilor is referring to is RBC Global Asset Management. They're one of our discretionary external providers. They provide professional expertise specifically on a discretionary basis. They make decisions within the parameters of the Municipal Act. And as you guys are well aware, the Municipal Act is very, very prescriptive and restrictive on the types of investments that can be made. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Any further comment? No? I see Annette back there. She's hiding behind the screen, so. I share Councillor Helmer's anticipation of the changing of the parameters here, because it is a fair bit of cash that could be used. I think, I understand the volatility, but even in balanced funds, a lot of it's pretty conservative, and I think you can imagine what the impact would be if the bump went up to an annualized 5% return. We're not looking for 15 and 18 or any of that sort of stuff, but an annualized return of 5% would be a significant impact and a significant benefit to the taxpayers whose money this actually is. So, and can be put back into services. So I'll take a motion on that, please. And a seconder. Call a question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, as I said, we're going to deal with Lorne Avenue after we go into confidential session. We'll go to number 11, and we have another request. And I had asked at the pre-meeting, I don't quite understand number 11 because it already is part of Sunfest. So do we get an answer on that, Clerk?
Through you, Mr. Chair, Sunfest is not designated as a municipal significant event, so that's why this has come forward.
Okay. So before, Councillor Usher, I know you have an ongoing. No, I'm okay. I'm okay. It's not that. It's not that? No. And just if I may, we've had one of these almost like every second corporate services meeting. And just a thought I had, if I may, it would be the idea that we look at delegating the authority to approve these to the clerk with certain parameters. That's not specific to 11, 12, or 13, but it seems like be a much more efficient way of dealing with this, both for the people who are applying, but also for council. So having made that comment, I'll turn to you, Councillor Usher.
Well, you hit part of what I was going to ask, but I'm not going to turn any of these down. So, especially the fact that this one is part of Sunfest, but Sunfest doesn't have it. I'm quite prepared to accept it. If it was alone by itself, yes, it would be. So I'm asking if we could do 11, 12, and 13, and also, Mr. Chair, all together. And I'm asking if we could come up with some kind of protocol to delegate this in the future. Thank you.
Can I do all three of them together? So we can move all three together, and if I could, perhaps council, it would be an added item or a separate item to have you investigate the delegation. Would that be better?
Yeah, or we're doing it anyway.
Sorry?
We're doing it anyways, part of the policy.
Okay, so the clerk tells me, and clerk, when would you have that back to us? Before the next season of outdoor events?
Through Mr. Chair, we can certainly move that forward and do it sooner. However, the intent was to bring it forward. As you know, we're going through a council policy review. This would be a new policy. So we were intending to bring that as part of phase 2 of the policy review. However, if you want it sooner, we can certainly bring that through as a separate policy.
As a new delegated authority, I'd like to see it separate rather than part of an omnibus thing, and I think you were doing another review of these, so the criteria, I think that should come forward separately. So, and as soon as you can.
We will do that.
By September?
Yeah, we can do it by September.
Okay, great. All right, you don't need a motion on that? Okay, good. So we'll do 11 through 13. I'll look for a motion on it. Councillor Park. Seconded. All in favor?
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
These remind me of the days when we used to do dog muzzling hearings.
I still do this.
Yes, I'll tell you about some of them. Councillor Usher will regale us with stories. Okay, turning to item number 14, two appointments, Anne-Marie DeSico Best and Landon Tulk onto the Town and Gown. We have a mover and a seconder. Any discussion? Councillor Helmer.
I'm happy to see someone with so much council experience coming onto an advisory committee. Hope they're ready for a former mayor coming onto an advisory committee.
She might have a little bit of inside information. I'll call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 5-0.
Council expense policy. This is an item brought to us by Councillor Van Holst. The intent here is to, this be referred to the governance working group to be directed to consider the possibility of changing the expense policy from a white list where only certain expenses are expressly allowed to a black list where only certain expenses are expressly prohibited. So, committee, Councillor Usher?
I just want to move it on.
Okay.
We don't need to talk about it.
Councillor Park, are you seconding that, or you want to speak to it? Go ahead.
Thank you. I recognize that sometimes it's a challenge for individual councillors when they have an idea or something that they want to participate in, perhaps as an event or a community gathering or something of that sort. But if it's not under the guise of the duty of a role of a councillor, I have trust in the fact with the oversight that we have in the clerk's office that they're giving us good advice, that this is not related to your role. That's why you're being denied this particular expense. I would like to note and file this. I think that there's a couple of things hitting our agenda today that perhaps we just don't need to be discussing. I think we did a lot of work at the beginning of our term in terms of our council expense policies based on some things that happened toward the tail end of the last term. And I think that the policy that we have in place is a good one and it's working. And unfortunately, some councillors don't feel that it's working for them at this point. So I'm in support of noting and filing this communication.
Okay, let me just ask a question before we get into a long discussion about it. Is there a seconder? If there's no seconder, it dies, and we'll just, we don't even need to note.
You need a motion to receive.
We need a motion just to receive it, the communication. Second that, please. Call a question. Item is item number 6.
Councillor Park, Councillor Morgan.
Sorry.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 5-0.
Okay. The next motion is, our item is number 16, also from Councillor Van Holst. The issue of meals at, and let me just be clear, the councillor's intent here is only for noon. So corporate services meeting that's at 12:30. It's all, and the odd time that Civic Works is at noon. It's only those ones. It's not dealing with the 4 o'clock raft of meetings, okay? Councillor Usher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I do respect the good intention, but I'm not prepared to talk about this. I'm quite prepared to leave this to the clerk. I think that the clerks, they have been looking at this. If I'm not, obviously they have been doing something because there's been improvement. So I'm quite prepared to just note and file, or receive, sorry.
Okay. Clerk, can you give us any guidance in terms of, is there an easier way to do this? I have, to me, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another. So, any comment?
Through you, Mr. Chair, We do, the clerk's office does order the food ahead of the meetings, obviously. It would be very helpful if we knew ahead of time from counselors who are not going to be attending or wish to attend that don't sit on the committee, so we actually know how much food to order. Also from a staff perspective, if we know there's extra staff coming or staff aren't coming that we normally would include in the numbers, that would certainly be helpful to us to control the amount of food that we're ordering. To be honest, it's not an easy task for the clerk's office. Whichever way we go, we get criticized. We've either ordered not enough food or too much food. We are doing our best, and we have different opinions from different members of council as to, I did try to survey this, and there was no consensus one way or the other as to whether to have the food or not have the food. But we will continue to do our best in the clerk's office to make sure we have sufficient food and the right amount of food ordered moving forward, with some assistance from people who are either going to be absent or who are coming that we wouldn't be aware of.
Other members of council, or committee rather. Councillor Helmer.
Well, I understand where Councillor Van Holst is coming from, and certainly I think the issue of wasting food is, we shouldn't do that, and I think it's reasonable to talk about it. I do want to keep it in scope, like this is a very small amount of food waste, and there's a lot bigger problems in food waste that we should be talking about as a council. And not to say that this one is not an example, and I do think that there's a important sort of signaling function, which is, you know, if we're going to go out in the community and talk about waste reduction and not wasting food, having practices that don't align with that is undermining that kind of messaging and making it more difficult for us. I agree with the idea of reducing the food waste. I do not agree with the idea that this is the way to do that. So I think we need to figure out ways to get the appropriate amount of food out for these meetings. I think one of the reasons I have an issue with this approach is that the food is not just for the councillors who are attending the meetings. And the issue of trying to figure out which staff are going to the meeting and who can get food upstairs and all the time costs of going up and down and, you know, every meeting, like I just don't think that necessarily is going to be easier. It's also very busy in the cafeteria at that time, and some people are cutting it very close getting to the meetings, and I think it has a lot of potential for unintended consequences. There is some efficiency for the folks in the kitchen staff, and I don't know if anyone's actually talked to the people who run the cafeteria about preparing the food all at once to take to a particular place. It's like a catering approach rather than the self-serve kind of thing that Councillor Van Holst is suggesting. That's why I'm not going to move this motion that he's asking for. I just don't think that it's necessarily going to solve the problem without introducing other problems. But I agree with the idea that we should be reducing it. And frankly, I would just say in general, we always have too much food. Yes, sometimes there's, you know, whatever people complain. I would rather deal with those complaints rather than having too much food and then wasting it. I also want to just point out, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on it, but there are reasonable ways that food gets eaten. It doesn't all go in the garbage. And so, especially in the evening meetings, which I know we're not talking about right here, it generally tends to disappear, which is good. And it's not going in the garbage necessarily just because we didn't eat it.
Okay. All right. I really wish we would frankly deal with these things off the floor of council. I hate talking about us because it's not about us. And this is about helping us be efficient, move forward. I think we get the sense of what the councillor's concern is. I applaud his concern. I have a motion to take no action and to receive from Councillor Usher. I'm going to receive it. And Councillor, I think the point's been well made in your letter. It's very clear. Thank you for that. Seconder to receive it.
Sorry, is Councillor Van Holst wanting to speak?
Yeah, I know he does, but we're moving along. We've had a discussion about it. There's no motion on the floor to take action on his item. So if you want to hear Councillor speak, I'll let Councillor speak. But
Thank you.
I'm trying to move it along. We have other guests waiting for in camera as well. Councillor, briefly.
Thank you very much. I only intended to make a brief comment, is that my request was just to make this an option for councillors. So it doesn't have to change anything for anybody else. It's just that if they want, they can say, please don't prepare anything for me ahead of time. I'll just get it if I need it. That way, food won't be wasted under the 4 scenarios that were described within there. So I do have a seconder at council. We can discuss it then, but I hope this would just pass. And as a point, I did hope this had been just dealt with administratively, because it has been done in the past.
Yeah. The clerk informs me that the provision that you've suggested is available to us to let them know that we're not coming. And I'd have to say, just for those of us who are coming from other employment, sometimes the predictability, I expected to be here at 12 today. I got stopped 3 times before I even got to the office. So it's variable, and we try and do our very best. So, okay, move it. It's called.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, could I have a motion? Oh, no, we'll deal with the appointment to EPAC. And I think we have the scores of the ranked ballot coming up on screen. So we have a tie? No. Sorry.
Through Mr. Chair, no. We had 7 candidates, and one of the candidates after round 1 had the highest.
Sorry, it's reverse numbers.
So that person was removed, leaving 6, and you need to appoint 6, so those are the 6.
So Heather Bailey was eliminated.
Right, because she
Sorry,
had the highest sum.
Yeah, sorry, I was doing reverse.
Yes, I'd be happy to move the motion to appoint the 6 who are left on the ranked ballot. This is a very good ranked ballot. It's very easy and effective when everybody follows the rules.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, folks, we'll have a motion to go in camera. Yes, clerk.
Mr. Chair, there is a revision to the reason for item C7. And it will read, a matter pertaining to personal matters about an identifiable individual with respect to employment-related matters and advice and recommendations of officers and employees of the corporation, including communications necessary for that purpose and advice that is subject to solicited client privilege, including communications necessary for that purpose and for the purpose of providing instructions and directions to officers and employees of the corporation. Closing the vote and the motion carries 5-0.
Yeah, we're gonna go across. Shit. A phone conference at 2:30. Okay, folks, we've got item number 10, and I'll note that there's a 10A, which is a request by William Cormer for delegation status. Mr. Cormer he's not here. I don't read lips very well. Do you want to come to the mic? No. Well, he's on his way?
That's what he said.
Yeah. Well, the meeting started at 1 o'clock, or at 12:30 rather. So, is there any appetite to grant delegation status to Mr. Cormer? I'm informed that it was just a phone request. We don't have any documentation on it.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to move the recommendation of staff recommendation for item number 10.
Councilor, I'm dealing with the request for delegation status first. I need to deal with that a priori. Councilor Helmer.
Well, I realize that he's not here right now, but if he shows up very soon, I'm fine to hear a delegation on the matter. It's been going on for quite some time. He's spoken to us about it before. I'm not sure what, if anything, is going to be new, but I would like to give him the opportunity if he's actually in the building. But if he's not in the building, I don't know. I'm not going to hold up the whole meeting.
Okay, so let's deal with item number 10. You have Councilor Usher's putting a motion to receive the staff, to approve the staff recommendation. Yeah, I'll look for a seconder on that. Okay, any discussion? Councilor Helmer?
Well, I think we did the right thing by proceeding with the plans for the demolition. We made that decision back in February, but then also leaving the door open to hear if there's any other unsolicited proposals in the meantime. And I think at this point, we're moving along with the demolition. I think it's reasonable to tell people, listen, stop sending unsolicited proposals. We're not going to consider them anymore. We've made our decision. We're moving forward on that front.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Morgan?
Yeah, well, like Councilor Helmer, I don't mind hearing what was said. It seems kind of a moot point if, we pass this and are returning unsolicited bids. So given if the person's here, should we not hear see if the committee's willing to hear the delegation before we pass the item that the delegation is related to?
Okay. I'm prepared to call the motion at this point. Yes.
So I'm just going to withdraw my second, and I'd rather just hear from Mr. Comer. He just walked in the building, and if he wants to speak, and I move that we hear his delegation.
Mr. Comer, you've got 5 minutes for delegation status. I need a motion. You have to withdraw your motion entirely, Councilor Usher. I have to say the meeting started at 12:30. So Councilor Usher, you've moved it. I'll have a motion to give Mr. Comer delegation status. You'll have to wait.
Oh, sorry.
Don't presume that it'll pass.
Oh,
I'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion is lost. Status, it is a tie.
Okay. Councilor Usher? You can put the motion back on the floor. Okay. Any further discussion on the matter? Okay, I will call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 4-0.
Okay, folks, is there any additional business? Okay, yes, if you would, Counselor Helmer.
I'd like to report progress on items C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, and C7.
Okay, so reported. Okay, I'll have a motion to adjourn. Counselor Usher, Counselor Morgan, all in favor? Carried. Thank you. For a long meeting.